and I'm with the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. DRGP seeks to promote cross-river connections and communication to preserve and enhance the natural, cultural, and recreational. Sorry about that. So anyway, I'll start. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Kunis, and I'm with the Delaware River Greenway Partnership. The DRGP seeks to promote cross-river connections and communication to preserve and enhance the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the Delaware River. The DRGP supports the Delaware River Scenic Byway, Lower Delaware Wild and Scenic, Delaware River Water Trail, and the Heritage Trail. Our next lecture is I Looked Up and There Was the Sky, the 2021 Mullica Hill Tornado by Melissa Zobrio on October 5th. Please allow me to introduce Gary Letcher. Gary's paddled the Delaware for more than 50 years. His first edition of Canoeing the Delaware was published in 1985 with 3 subsequent editions. After a career in environmental law, Gary retired to Lewes, Delaware, where he often serves as an instructor at the Lifelong Learning Institute at University of Delaware. Now let's go on a cruise through history on the Delaware River.
Ready for me?
Ready.
Thank you, Cindy. First of all, sound check. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. You're looking at me sitting here at home in Lewes, Delaware, and I'm wearing this heavy red shirt. Why the heck is he wearing a heavy red shirt? Because this is my special Delaware River canoe trip shirt. Can you see that? I got that patch. I think it's an old Boy Scout patch. I saw it on eBay and I just had to have it. My son said, "Dad, you're such a nerd." Yes, I am a Delaware River nerd and proud of it. And I'm always happy to share my time, to spend time with other Delaware River nerds like I suspect most of you will admit to being. I'm sure I have met some of you in person, perhaps on the Sojourn or other river events, and I'm happy to be with you again. Some of you might know of me only as author of the Paddler's Guide to the Delaware River. As Cindy mentioned, the first edition was published by Rutgers University Press back in 1985, which kind of tells you how old I am. And now we're on a 4th edition, just published this past June, completely revised and updated. I want to thank Cindy for inviting me to visit with you this evening, and Mark for keeping the technology in line, or at least under control. Oh, come on now. Oh, Mark, my advance is not working.
Maybe try clicking on the slide with your mouse.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
There you go.
Something happened. Okay. All right. We'll get through this, I promise. As the blurb said, what I plan to do is take us on a historic cruise down the beautiful Delaware River. I suspect it's a cruise many of you are familiar with, at least parts of the way. Being a cruise, I want to focus on some of the watercraft that have plied our river and some of the people that piloted those watercraft. We'll take some shore excursions and visit some of the people and events that have punctuated the river's history. This image is a painting by George Innes, 1861, of the Hudson River School of Art artist. And we can see, obviously, it's a Delaware water gap. We can see a couple of timber rafts coming down the river. Here comes a train down the left side. I'm not quite sure which line that might have been. Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, perhaps. Innes painted 8 or 10 versions of this image with different skies and different lighting and different things on the river. Very popular image. I think this hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So talking about watercraft, let's begin with canoes, the first craft to cruise the Delaware River. Indians of the mid-Atlantic states made their canoes by burning and scraping out fallen trees. Not of birch bark, because we don't have the kind of birch trees that lend themselves to making canoes. This image is a woodcut from as long ago as 1588, the manner of making their boats in the newfound land of Virginia. And pretty accurately, I think, depicts how the Lenape and other native peoples built their canoes. The Lenape made their canoes out of the tulip poplar tree. And you've seen them on the riverbanks and on the islands, tall, straight, thick trunk. In fact, they call the tulip poplar Muxulhamensi, which means the tree from which canoes are made. In the mid-1800s, a farmer in the Hackensack area was plowing his field and discovered a fully intact Lenape canoe. Well, he took it, and he took this prize and did what any respectable farmer would do. He painted it blue and nailed it to the side of his barn as a feed trough for his cows. Years later, this old boat was stored in the von Steubenhaus Museum in Hackensack, and now is on display in the State Museum in Trenton. The next craft I want to talk about is the sailing ships from Europe. In 1524, a ship appeared off the coast of New Jersey, captained by this fellow, Giovanni de Verrazano. The ship was called La Dauphine, means, of course, the dolphin. Verrazano was the first European encountered by the Lenape and other Native Americans of this region. Here's a map of his travels. He hit South or North Carolina, saw the Chesapeake Bay, and you might see here, I don't know, does my mouse show? He kind of missed Delaware Bay and Delaware River. Went into New York Harbor and built a great big bridge, and then he sailed back home. There's a little monument to Verrazano, established by the Italian American Club right here where I live in Rehoboth Beach, right against the boardwalk. Some use the flowers every year. It was almost 90 years later when the next European explorer came upon the waters of the mid-Atlantic states. Henry Hudson. In 1609, sailing his ship, the Half Moon, up the coast of the eastern seaboard and into New York Harbor. In New York Harbor, Hudson encountered a group of Lenape Indians in their canoes. Here's a map of his voyages. In 1609, Hudson is his red voyage. He came down here and tooled around Chesapeake Bay and went up, and he dipped the nose of the Half Moon into Delaware Bay, looking for a northwest passage, the fabled all-water route from Europe to Asia. Well, he got his ship stuck on the sandbars 7 times, faced with a strong current coming out of the river, and decided the Delaware was not the northwest passage. But he put the river on his map and called it the South River. From there, he went north into the Hudson River all the way up to Albany, then came back and returned to Europe. 2 years later, you see this purple voyage up here. Hudson, still looking for a northwest passage, sailed into what's called Hudson's Bay. Well, he might have been a fine navigator, but Hudson was a petulant and stern captain. On his second voyage, this is 1611, his crew had had enough and they mutinied. They put Henry Hudson, his young son, and several loyal officers into a small boat in Hudson's Bay and set them adrift. That was the last anybody saw of Henry Hudson. The very next year, after Hudson, quote, discovered the Delaware, in 1610, this fellow, Admiral Samuel Argall, who later captured Pocahontas as a bargaining trip in negotiations with the Powhatan Indians. Argall was the captain of the Virginia fleet. He was sailing from England to Jamestown and wound up rescuing the colony, which was starving and under constant attack by the local natives, and just about to give up and go home. Well, Argall and his fleet of ships saved the day and brought with him a new governor of the Virginia colony, this man, Governor Thomas West. West, of course, being a proper British nobleman, had a title, Baron Delaware. The next year, 1611, when Samuel Argall was sailing back to England, he passed the waters of Delaware, of what Hudson called the South River, and named it after his governor, Delaware. So the name stuck to the bay, especially because Argall didn't go up the river. The name stuck not only to the bay, but to the entire river itself, to the native people who lived along it, and ultimately to my home state of Delaware. Apparently, Governor West was not impressed by this honor, for he set sail to England without ever bothering to gaze upon Delaware Bay or river, and never met a Lenape Indian. Alas, Governor West died at sea on his return voyage to England. Crazy. All right, let's continue our voyage here. We all know this place. Over millions of years, the river carved a gouge 1,300 feet deep into the Kittatinny Ridge at the Delaware Water Gap. What are the names of the mountains on either side? Well, the right is Mount Mincy, named after the northern tribe of the Lenape. And the New Jersey side, the left, is Mount Tammany. I love this picture. I've seen several renditions of this old postcard. This one has a biplane flying over it. Apparently that was photoshopped in, or in the 1910 version of Photoshop, because I've seen the same image with a blimp flying over it and a monoplane and various other things in the river. So everything old is new again, I suppose. The mountain in the Jersey side is called Mount Tammany. But where does that name come from? And who was Tammany? You might have heard the name in another context, but who was he really? Well, look at this. Who knows the name of this painting? Yes, Peaceable Kingdom. From the book of Isaiah, the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. This painting by Edward Hicks, 1820. You might have seen other versions of this scene. As Edward Hicks, a devout Quaker, was, you might say, obsessed and painted 61 different versions of A Peaceable Kingdom. So there's the lion and the kid and the lamb and the wolf. But what's happening down here in the background at a place that looks a lot to me like the Delaware Water Gap? Let's blow it up a little bit. Here's the group down by the river. We have this fat old man in the center, that being William Penn. And over here on the left, this regal-looking Indian, and that would be Tammany. Peaceable Kingdom was about the artist's perception of an idyllic life in a utopian America. And depicted here is the peace treaty between William Penn and the Lenape wise man Tammany. The treaty was actually made at a place called Shackamaxon in Philadelphia in 1682, when Penn met with Tammany and other Lenape, in the shade of a great elm tree by the banks of the Delaware, where they agreed to live in peace, to respect each other, and to not trespass on each other's lands. The written document, if there was one, hasn't survived. But Lenape women were there to remember the words, as was their custom, because they had no written language. And they reported that Tammany said, "We will live in love with William Penn and his children as long as the creeks and rivers run, and while the sun, the moon, and the stars endure." Quite a sentiment. Penn's treaty with Tammany and this image of it was chosen as one of only 19 pivotal events portrayed on the frieze inside the dome of the United States Capitol at Washington. And here perhaps is another version in which Penn wasn't offering peace, but cough syrup. Apparently, old Tammany had a cold. The site of the Shakamatsin Treaty is now preserved in Penn Treaty Park, part of the Philadelphia City Park System. Tammany himself, as leader of his tribe, not exactly a king, I think of him more as a wise man, was highly regarded not only among the Indians, but among the settlers, that some even called him King Tammany or Saint Tammany, the patron saint of early America. You may have heard of St. Tammany Parish in Louisiana, especially when a hurricane is about to make landfall. May 1st was celebrated as King Tammany Day throughout the Middle Atlantic states, celebrated with dancing, fireworks, and plenty of beer and rum. Across the United States, Tammany societies were formed to promote brotherhood and charity in their communities, much like the Lions Club or the Elks and the Masons. Some of these societies did just that, and others, we might say, evolved into something different. Led by the infamous boss Tweed, Tammany Hall in New York became synonymous with political corruption, greed, and thuggery. And so the name of the wise man Tammany was forever besmirched, because that is the most familiar usage of the name Tammany, Tammany Hall. If you look in the alcove, you can see in this poster the alcove on the top, and the building is still there. Tammany Hall was for a long time an office of the New York City Department of Education. And the alcove is a statue of Tammany looking out over the crowd, and he does not look happy. In other ways, the better side of Tammany lives on today. Here's his statue at Penn's Landing in Philadelphia, an eagle on his shoulder and standing on a great turtle, the totem of his Lenape clan. And at the Delaware Water Gap, this magnificent mountain bears his name, where if you stand back and at just the right place, you can see the wise old man profiled in the rock face of the cliffs, a face of stone with a forest headdress. Can you see him? Yes, show of hands, you see him. He's there. Tammany's peace did indeed last as long as William Penn survived, but did not last beyond their lifetimes. The last straw came with the infamous walking purchase of 1737. You've probably heard of it. Let me fill in some of the details. Here is how it went down. A son of William Penn showed a document to the Lenapes that he said was agreed by his father in Tammany years before. The deed said that the Lenape would cede all their land within a day-and-a-half walk from Wrightstown, Bucks County. Now, this was a common way to measure land for such grants at that time. And the Lenape assumed that this would cover about 25 miles. But young Penn had other ideas, and they sent 3 athletes, supported with supplies on horseback, covering 65 miles and taking a big chunk of eastern Pennsylvania. You can see the boundaries of the walking purchase right there. The Lenape Observer was not happy. He is quoted as saying, "He run, that not fair, he was to walk." This possessed and displeased most of the Lenape relocated to points west, western Pennsylvania and Ohio, while those that remained fought viciously against the American settlers in both the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution. One of the runners was a fellow named Edward Marshall, who later acquired what is now called Treasure Island near Point Pleasant, Pennsylvania. It was called Marshall's Island for hundreds of years. Some years while Marshall lived there, a party of Lenape kidnapped and killed his wife, perhaps in retaliation for Edward's hurry walk, dispossessing the Lenape of their lands. I've read that some say the ghost of Marshall's wife still haunts the nearby forest. All right, even this was not the end of the story. There's a historical marker about the walking purchase and the showing how much of Pennsylvania was actually scammed away from the natives. In just 2004, the Delaware Nation sued the state of Pennsylvania for return of some of the land scammed from them in the infamous Walking Treaty. But the court ruled that under the laws of Aboriginal rights, the sovereign, back in the day, the William Penn family, and now the state of Pennsylvania, had absolute power to terminate title to Indian lands, even by fraud. So even though the supposed deed was a fake, and even though the walk measuring the territory was a fraud, the Delaware Nation could not regain title to its lands. Okay, let's go further upriver, way upriver, near Damascus, Pennsylvania. It was 1764, before the American Revolution. A young pioneer named Daniel Skinner had some extra pork and grain to sell. But in the wilderness, there was no market for that. He cut down some pine trees to build a raft and floated his goods 200 miles down all the way to Philadelphia. He tied up at the wharf, and the merchants came to see what he had. They couldn't believe he'd come so far. All the way from where? They'd never heard of it. Everyone assumed that the river upstream was blocked by rapids at Trenton, New Hope, and especially at Foul Rift. Well, the merchant says, I'll give you $10 for your grain. And let's see, $20 for your pork. And so while young Skinner unloaded his cargo, the merchants took a look at his raft. Son, says the merchant, and I'll give you $100 for your logs. Philadelphia needed lumber for building houses and especially for building ships. So Daniel Skinner went home and he walked 200 miles with a lot more cash than he expected. Boys, he says to his friends, guess what? Well, the rush was on. The pioneers had been struggling to scratch farms out of the wilderness when real wealth stood in the forest all around them. Not only on the Delaware, but the Susquehanna, the Juniata, the Allegheny, and other rivers of the mid-Atlantic states became highways for timber rafts. Every year, thousands of rafts came down the Delaware from the hinterlands to market at Easton, at Philadelphia, and at Trenton. The lumbermen would cut the timber in the fall and winter, then sluice and sled it to the river's edge to be off as soon as the ice went out. The rafts were bound together with iron spikes and saplings. They weren't rowed or propelled, but just floated with the current, steered side to side by huge oars balanced at either end. If the captain wanted to go left, he'd shout, Jersey, even if it was in New York, and to the right, Pennsylvania. And this was how the raftsmen made their turns, avoided the islands, and avoided the rocks and bridges. Rafting was a tough job, and these were tough guys. One contemporaneous account described the raftsmen as, and I quote, great, fierce-looking fellows they were, shaggy-bearded, long-haired, bronzed by exposure to heat and weather. All right, now we're going to try a video, and I have this wonderful old video from, I think, 1915 of timber rafting in Sweden. but it's exactly the same as timber rafting on our Delaware River. It has the sound of a tinkling piano that we may or may not Farewell. I hope you could hear that and could see it okay. What strikes me is how wet that was. These were not waterproof craft. And they were coming down in March and April, and it was cold. So I hope they got paid well. At night, the raftsmen would tie up at the eddies, that is, slow spots in the river, sometimes hundreds of rafts at a time, where they'd spend the night in the little villages and especially enjoy the fare at the local taverns. Many towns along the river, even today, bear names like Long Eddy and Sants Eddy, Upper Black Eddy, Black being the name of the tavern owner, all once popular layovers for the shaggy, bearded, long-haired timber raftsmen. Many other places, down to individual rocks, were given names by the raftsmen, important guideposts to making their way down the river. Every rapid, rift, and turn in the river had a name. And I think many of those names are as relevant to modern paddlers as they were to the raftsmen. And to the extent I could discover them, I do include them in my book. Names like the Cellar Hole, which was where the river made a sharp turn in Hawk's Nest. Calculation Rock, where if the water was up to a certain level of a rock, you could pass Jersey of Groundhog Island. Woodpecker Lane, the right side of Trenton Falls at Trenton, where the sharp rocks would tear a raft to pieces. The timber business was no quaint backwoods enterprise, but the very backbone of the Delaware Valley economy for more than 100 years. As you can imagine, slashing down the forest was devastating to the Delaware Valley environment. Even back in the 19th century, people were well aware that clearing the forests brought bigger and more frequent floods. What had been lush islands became scrubby gravel bars. What had been rich riverside farms were buried in sand and silt. The channel, even below tidewater at Trenton, became clogged. It took more than 100 years, but eventually all the trees were gone. First the majestic pines and hemlocks, then the stately oaks, chestnuts, and hickories. The hillsides were bare. In 1917, the last timber raft, made of crummy second growth lumber, floated alone to a mill at Easton. Today, the forests have mostly regrown, although not with the original pines and hemlocks, but the Delaware Valley and hillsides are again cloaked in a thick hardwood forest. And Daniel Skinner, the first raftsman, who hailed himself as the Lord High Admiral of the Delaware, is still with us too, in a way. Near Damascus, where he launched his first raft, is a major rapid that bears his name, Skinner's Falls. I suspect everyone on this call has been through Skinner's Falls at least once, and some of us, me too, have swamped. But on any summer weekend, the spirit of Daniel Skinner lives on, throwing a party where folks soak up the sun, fire up a barbecue, wade in the shallows, and watch the people trying to make it through Skinner's namesake rapids. Let's move on to another kind of boat that was commercially important on the Delaware. These were called Durham boats. Looking like a big canoe, they were double-ended and flat-bottomed, able to navigate up and down the rapids of the Delaware. They were used to haul iron from Durham Furnace near Easton, grain, other goods. Perhaps at one time there was 1,000 Durham boats plying the Delaware. You might have seen, if you've gone through Foul Rift and some other places, there are iron rings bolted into the rocks that were used to pulley the Durham boats up the river hundreds of years ago. Now, you've certainly seen a Durham boat, although you might not have known it by that name. Oh, I love this picture. This is on the Mohawk River, but Durham boats, and it shows the versatility. Going upriver, the fellows down here on the left are poling the boat up the river, while the one of the big Durham boat in the middle is sailing through what looks like to be an eel weir to me, that V of the rocks facing downstream. The Durham boats we have all seen is this one in Washington crossing the Delaware. It was early December in 1776, after retreating from disastrous defeats at New York, that Washington orders his men to sequester all the boats, especially, he said, the Durham boats, to the Pennsylvania side of the river. And on Christmas night, made the famous crossing by rowing and poling the icy river to a surprise attack of the Hessian garrison at Trenton, breathing new life into the revolutionary cause. Every year on Christmas Day, Washington's crossing is reenacted in full costume and regalia, including the trusty old Durham boats. To see if thousands of spectators. I've been there, and many of you probably have too, and if not, go this Christmas. Thousands of spectators line the bridge and the riverbank to see if the general and his army will once again make it across. Unlike 1776, today, if the river is too high or too icy, the reenactors eschew the boats and march across the bridge. Built just 58 years after Washington led his ragtag army across the river. I just love how these reenactors are completely in character, looking tough and determined as they walk across the Delaware. Either way, the reenactment is a spectacle I can highly recommend. Durham boats became obsolete the day the Lehigh Canal opened along the Delaware, about 1825. Barges totaled by mules or oxen didn't have to deal with rapids. They didn't have to deal with rocks in the river, and they could go upstream as easily as down. This is the Delaware Canal in Pennsylvania. Some of you might recognize that at what is now the Golden Pheasant Inn near Point Pleasant. no less than 5 canals ran along or across the river, mostly carrying Pennsylvania mountain coal to market in the cities, but also grain, lumber, and farm goods. Now let's see if we can point them out here. Up here we had the Delaware and Hudson Canal at Honesdale, crossing at Lackawax and then along the river to Port Jervis, named a port because it was a port on the canal. We had the Lehigh Canal coming down from the coal fields of the Wilkes-Barre area and along the Lehigh River, crossing the river or reaching the river at Easton, where it continues downstream as the Delaware Division Canal, or we just call it Delaware Canal State Park, on the west side of the river. While on the east side, the Morris Canal goes across New Jersey to the Hudson River. The Delaware and Raritan Canal, shown here, started in Trenton, actually starts, as we know, up at Bulls Island. In addition, there's the Schuylkill Canal, which comes into the river, into the Delaware at Philadelphia. I like to say the roads west were paved with water. Canaling was often a family affair. Here we have Pa steering the boat, Ma's peeling potatoes, and it looks like the kids are wishing they had iPhones. Sometimes the littlest children will be charged with driving the mules or oxen along the towpath as they slowly made their way parallel to the Delaware. Not just cargo, the canals also carried people. The passenger boats were called packet boats, P-A-C-K-E-T, packet boats. And the proprietors painted their boats up and had horns and sirens and gongs, trying to outcompete one another. And as they approached the lock to get the lock keeper's attention, they would blow all their bells and whistles to get their boat safely through. And now you know where that phrase comes from. Everyone knows where this is, the Hawk's Nest, just north of Port Jervis, one of the most spectacular stretches of roadway in the eastern United States. Here's how it looked 150 years ago. The Delaware and Hudson Canal, tightly hugging the bank, all along the way through Hawk's Nest, the Erie Railroad on the other side. The canal was built 40 feet above the river in places through Hawk's Nest. You can see a boat making a turn here as he comes up from Port Jervis. And here's a apparently empty boat waiting its turn in the lock, just coming out of Hawk's Nest on the way to Mongaub. What's interesting about this image is you can see the end of the canal coming down the rails to the right. The railroads are much faster and in the end, much cheaper than traffic on the canals. This is the Delaware and Raritan Canal at Cadwallader Park in Trenton. For a while, the railroad, and I think it was the Belvedere and Delaware Railroad there. If I'm wrong, someone correct me. For a while, the railroad owned both the rails and the canal and operated them simultaneously. Of course, the Delaware and Raritan Canal is now the aqueduct for New Brunswick and other parts of central New Jersey, carrying Delaware River water to those communities. The canals were banned in about 1900, put out of business by the railroads, and fell into disuse. Here's an image of the remnant canal at Pond Eddy, long before New York 97 was paved. And sometimes all you can find is a remnant of the canal, like this old lock in the forest. I think this one is at Mongaub. Some of the canals have been preserved in state parks. Delaware Canal in Pennsylvania, parts of the Morris Canal in New Jersey, and of course, Delaware and Raritan Canal. There's another canal that some of you upriver might not know about, and that's the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, also built as a towpath canal between Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware River in the early 1800s. It began as a little canal, like the Delaware Canal up around Easton, but over the years was expanded to carry heavy shipping. with cities at either end, Chesapeake City in Maryland and Delaware City in Delaware. This is about 1900 and looks like a passenger ship of some kind passing through. Those of you who have driven down to Rehoboth Beach or Ocean City have crossed the Delaware and Chesapeake Canal over this great bridge just south of Wilmington, where the canal is still used as a shortcut between Baltimore and Philadelphia. Another craft on our Delaware was the ferries. Here's a lovely painting of a ferry near Camden, New Jersey in 1779, carrying the finest people and a fine pair of horses and carriage. Everywhere there is a bridge today, the river was once crossed by a ferry. Horses and wagons, foot traffic, and later cars were shuttled back and forth at more than 40 ferry crossings on the Delaware. And in fact, one artist, this is, for example, the ferry at Long Eddy, New York, very typical of how these ferries work. And for the most part, they were not rowed or propelled by anything other than the current of the river. You know how to do this in a canoe or kayak. You tilt the stern of your boat sort of in the direction you want to go and back paddle, and the current pushes you sideways across the river. So these cable ferries had a cable that held them stationary, the equivalent of back paddling. The ferryman would tilt the stern of his boat in the direction he wanted to go, and the current would push him across. Now, this ferry at Long Eddy, New York, way up the river, almost to Hancock, was interesting because the iron bolts that held the ferry cable and part of the cable itself are still lying there on the riverbank on the Pennsylvania side, a remnant of a ferry operation that stopped well over 100 years ago. This is a little later in time, Hartzell's Ferry, also known as Myers Ferry. Whoever happened to own the ferry at the time got to name it, usually after their family. This is about 1915, one of the last ferries to cross the Delaware, near where Driftstone Campground is now. And in fact, Ferry Lane comes down through the campground on the other side, Delaware River Family Campground. There's a ferry lane right there, intersects with Route 46. This ferry went out of business when one of the last timber rafts careened down the river and crashed into the ferry, killing 4 people that were riding the ferry. Shuttling canoes has always been a puzzle, and it still is, but this is one way to do it in 1920. Just put your canoe on the top of the car and take the ferry across. I think this was the Caramac Ferry just north of the Watergap. One artist probably more accurately predicts Washington crossing the Delaware on a ferry boat, not a Durham boat, because it would be hard to get the cannon and the horses into a Durham boat. I think this image is on display at Washington Crossing State Park, New Jersey. Everyone's crossed this bridge, I presume, Interstate 295, the Delaware Memorial Bridge. Well, as I said, everywhere there's a bridge today, there was once a ferry. I don't know if anyone on this call is old enough to remember taking this ferry, but my mom used to tell me about it when she went to college at Duke. It was called the Newcastle-Pennsville Ferry. Just a couple miles downriver from where the bridge is today. The traffic tied up for hours waiting for the next available boat to take them across the river. You can see 3 of those boats in this image right here, and there are probably a dozen more. The bridge was built in about 1950 as a single bridge, and the second bridge added about 1960. There's a couple other little ferries that cross the river. This is called the River Link in Philadelphia. It goes between Penn's Landing on the Pennsylvania side and the Camden waterfront on the New Jersey side. This is an interesting picture too for the other watercraft that are depicted. Obviously the battleship New Jersey, a terrific visit if you're ever in Camden. In the middle here, it looks like an oil tanker of some kind. And in the background, the stacks of what? The SS United States, which in 1952 set the speed record for crossing the Atlantic, a record that still holds. Now, what's going to happen to that old ship is still up in the air, but it's going to be expensive. Finally, a shout out to my hometown. I hear this ferry toot its horn every morning. The Lewes Cape May ferry, taking the cruise between Delaware and New Jersey, an 85-minute ride from one side to the other. Here it is passing the outer Harbor of Refuge lighthouse in Delaware Bay. Well, bridges are more efficient than ferries for crossing the river. And this was the very first bridge to cross the Delaware. Joe Donnelly, Public Information Officer at the Toll Bridge Commission, dug up this picture for me. And I see that Joe gave a presentation to the Greenway Partnership some time ago. He's a wonderful speaker. This is the first bridge at Trenton, called the Lower Trenton Bridge, built in 1806. This is not only the first bridge to cross the Delaware, but very importantly, was the major link between Philadelphia and New York, the biggest cities in America at the time. Now, these spikes sticking up on the top of the bridge are not cell phone towers. They are a newfangled device called lightning rods. Fire by lightning was a hazard to all these old wooden covered bridges. Now, take a look at the big stone piers holding this 1806 bridge up. And they are still there today at the modern Lower Trenton Bridge. Everyone calls it the Trenton Makes Bridge. The piers have been expanded from the original, but much of the original stone is still there in place. The Trenton Makes, the World Takes sign has been there and illuminated since 1911 initially on a previous version of the Lower Trenton Bridge. We'll go upriver to the Northampton Street Bridge between Easton and Phillipsburg. I like this picture because it shows a trolley car crossing the bridge. The second bridge across the Delaware was built here only 2 years after the Lower Trenton Bridge. This beautiful cantilever truss design was built, I think, 1880 something. 1888 rings a bell. It's in my book. And it was a strong bridge. The bridges before it were low, the piers were close together, and they were a real hazard to the timber rafters. But the bridge could not withstand the 1955 flood caused by Hurricanes Connie and Diane. The flood cleaved the Northampton Street Bridge clean in two. First, on August 14, Hurricane Connie came up and crossed right over the region. Then just a week later, Hurricane Diane came. Together, they dumped 20 inches of rain in the Delaware River watershed. By far, the greatest flood of record on the Delaware River, or most parts of the Delaware River, anyway. The Northampton Street Bridge was reconstructed in only 2 years and opened to traffic in 1957, and has remained at the important crossing that it is today ever since. A little further up the river, between Portland and Columbia, was what was then the longest covered bridge in the United States and the last covered bridge across the Delaware. This is the Portland-Columbia Bridge. At the left end here, you can see the home of the toll keeper. This was a toll bridge. It wasn't free. A man named Charlie Newbaker. Well, when the hurricanes Connie and Diane came along, the bridge that had been there for 150 years could stand no more and washed into the river. This was the end of the last covered bridge across the Delaware. It's said that bridge keeper Charlie Newbaker stood by in uniform to watch as his bridge washed away, and his ghost still stands every time the river rises. You might well know that the Portland Columbia pedestrian bridge is built on the piers that supported the old covered bridge. Come on. All right, let's go up to the last bridge I want to talk about. You all know this bridge, the Lackawaxen Aqueduct, or the Roebling Bridge at Lackawaxen. But let's start with this historic picture, which I think gives us some context. This has to be like an 1860 or 1870 picture, very old photograph. The important thing here is upstream from the bridge, we can see the old dam. Now, originally, the canal between the Delaware and Hudson Canal between Honesdale and eventually the Hudson River had to cross the Delaware here at Lackawaxen. So the canal company put a dam in the river. And they barged the canal boats across the river above the dam. And you can see a gate lock to the canal right here, where the barges would come off the river and back into the canal on the New York side. Looks like a boat basin here where they would do repair work on the boats or store them. But this dam was a hazard. It was a hazard to the timber rafts coming down. Not only did they break up sometimes when they went over the dam, but they would collide with the barges. And there were lawsuits, frequent lawsuits, and both sides were losing money. So the canal company hired Roebling, the Roebling Company, to build a suspension bridge across the river, the bridge we're all familiar with today. This is the bridge when it was being operated as a private toll bridge in about 1980, before it was reconstructed by the Park Service to resemble its present condition. That is my lovely wife there inspecting the wooden plank deck of the Roebling Bridge. The innovation of this bridge was the wire rope, that is the spun steel cable that Roebling patented and employed, that found use across bridges all around the world, and at the time had uses, for example, elevator shafts. And the trick was this device here. This is the machine that spun strands of steel wire into these multifaceted braided cables right at the site of construction. So the spools of the wire would be brought up, probably on the canal barges, to the site of the bridge construction, where they would be spun across the river to bear the weight of the canal. Great old picture of a barge actually coming across the Roebling's Aqueduct at Lackawaxen. A couple of mules hauling it through. And a postcard showing the last boat on the D&H Canal passing through Lackawaxen. Now, that's not the Delaware River, that's the Lackawaxen River that the boat is crossing. The Delaware River is right around the corner. This brings us back to canoes. The earliest written account I've found for a long-distance canoe trip on the Delaware from Port Jervis to Philadelphia was published in 1886 in a magazine called Athletics and Manly Sport, titled Down the Delaware in a Canoe by John Boyle O'Reilly. Here's a picture of Mr. O'Reilly, and yes, that is his mugshot. The Delaware was not O'Reilly's first experience in a small boat, so let's take a look at his background. As a young man in Ireland, O'Reilly was a leader of the Free Irish Insurgency, a real thorn in the side of British rule. In 1865, he was arrested and convicted of inciting rebellion in Ireland and sentenced to 20 years in the prison colonies of Australia. While he escaped the prison, he commandeered a rowboat which took him out into the Indian Ocean, where he basically flagged down a whaling ship that brought him to Philadelphia. He became a noted journalist and poet, and is supposed to have been President John Kennedy's favorite poet. O'Reilly's favorite pastime seems to have been canoeing the rivers of the eastern states, including the Connecticut River, the Susquehanna, and especially our Delaware. And as an accomplished writer, we have a good record of his sojourns. Also, they brought along in 1886 a new technology of cameras, and they documented their trip along the river. Now, although he called his craft a canoe, we might call this today a kayak with a semi-closed hull and a double-bladed paddle. Now think about this. In 1886, there was no Kittatinny canoes or Bob Landers to shuttle you from point to point. There was no cars to take you from Philadelphia. And what roads there were really just dirt trails. So how did they get upriver with all their canoes and all their gear? Well, obviously they took the train. They stowed their gear in the baggage car and hopped aboard the local to Port Jervis. And there they set off, staying in hotels and campgrounds along the way. I shouldn't say campgrounds, camping along the way. For food, try this sometime. They politely knocked on the door of local farmers, offering to buy whatever victuals the farmer's wife could spare. Also recall that in the 1880s, the timber raft business was still in full swing, and recreational boaters had an advantage then we don't have today. They could hitch a ride on a raft. O'Reilly did this, as well as others that I have read about. If you got tired or wanted to avoid high water or bad weather, you could just tie your boat up alongside the raft and hitch a ride. Not only could you get along without paddling, you might enjoy the company of fellow travelers and share a hot-cooked meal or two. Now look at this picture. This is a really luxurious timber raft. I'm not even sure it's actually a timber raft. There's not one but two canoes parked alongside. It has a cabin with a little smokestack for a cooking stove and an ensuite bathroom hanging off the back end. Around the turn of the 20th century, canoes began to return to the Delaware. Fast trains brought tourists to resorts at the Delaware Water Gap and other holiday havens. This is the Kittatinny House at the Delaware Water Gap. They had their own little steamboat called the Launch, or also called the Kittatinny, to take passengers on excursions up and down the river. The Delaware Water Gap was one of the premier resorts in the country, and several grand hotels grew to serve the upscale tourist trade. The railroads too promoted canoeing on the Delaware, this one by the Lackawanna Railroad. If she were my partner, I would politely ask that she turn around and paddle. Not only the Kittatinny Hotel, which stood at what is now Resort Point Overlook in the Water Gap, but up the hill from that, the Water Gap House, a little further away, the Glenwood Hotel Vacation Paradise. These are big places, each of them having hundreds of rooms. The Castle Inn, part of which is still there in downtown Delaware Water Gap, Pennsylvania. Up here you can see the old railroad bridge. Now there's just pilings of it remain. And everyone knows this, built as the Buckwood Inn in 1906, today the Shawnee Inn Resort. As the Shawnee Inn does today, all these resorts offered canoes and other small boats for use by their patrons. I particularly like this picture. This must be the Kittatinny House boat area, because here's their launch out in the river. But here's a modern picture, what I think is the very same place. Canoes all lined up, ready to be rented. Aside from the lavish resorts, there were more casual getaways, mostly around the Delaware Water Gap. This is Camp Caramac. It was pitched to young singles, romance and a hint of scandal, located at the old bridge pilings, if you know where that is, where Broadhead Creek comes into the Delaware. It was popular from the 1880s until the 1950s. Today, only traces remain. This concrete wall, I think, is still there. There's a set of stairs coming down to the river. Other than that, there's not much hint that Caramac ever existed. Right in the water gap itself was Kittatinny Beach. Picnic area, swimming beach, and in that little white house, a tavern. Until the 2006 flood, that old tavern served as the Delaware Water Gap Recreation Area Visitor Center. Kittatinny Beach was run by Ernie and Edna Olszewski for many years, beginning in the 1940s. And at the request of some fishermen, they agreed to shuttle their boats upriver. The Olszewski daughter, Ruth, married Frank Jones in the 1950s, and together, Ruth Jones built the business, that canoe shuttle business, into Kittatinny Canoes. Ruth is still today, rightfully so, known as the Queen of the Delaware. My favorite little resort up there was called Island Park Bathing Beach. This is located on what is now Schellenberger's Island, right under the Interstate 80 river crossing. They had picnic tables, picnic grounds, they had a merry-go-round, they had games, they had canoes for rent, and my favorite thing is a big water slide right in the river. The canoes of the day were made of wooden ribs covered with a lacquered canvas shell. It's the kind of canoe I learned to paddle in at Boy Scout camp, and probably, like many of the ones you learned to paddle in, what seems like not so long ago. They handle pretty well. They're beautiful, but each had to be handmade. Some are almost works of art. You can still get kits to make these, and people still do. But they had problems. A serious rock could tear one in half and leave you walking home. And now we come to World War II and this Hellcat fighter plane built by the Grumman Aircraft Company. It helped win the war in Europe and the Pacific. Soon after the war, company executive William Hoffman took a well-earned vacation in the Adirondacks. As they portaged their heavy wood canoe, his companion joked it was too bad their boat wasn't made of aluminum. Well, Hoffman laughed. But hey, wait a minute, I've got a warehouse full of aluminum. And so was born the Grumman aluminum canoe. Lightweight, mass-produced, and cheap, the original Grumman canoe made the modern rental and livery business possible. Many of you, including me, had their very first canoeing experience in a rented aluminum canoe on the Delaware River. Today, there's more than 20 outfitters offering canoes, kayaks, stand-up paddle boards, inflatables, and other craft for hire. We have events like the Delaware River Sojourn, cleanup sponsored by the Greenway Partnership and others, the Lenape Rising Nation Cruise, and any number of group celebrations of the river. And so we've come from Lenape canoes back in the day to our modern plastic and Kevlar craft. Then as now, dodging through the rapids, lazing along the eddies, camping atop the river banks, perhaps catching a fine bass, taking an actual cruise on our beautiful and historic Delaware River. I want to conclude with a few words about my book and related material. In preparing this fourth edition of the book, I did some informal market research, primarily through the Sojourn and a couple of websites, to ask what the people want to see in a revised edition of this book. And the most popular answer was waterproof maps that I can take on the river. Well, what a good idea. So I plan to have waterproof maps incorporated for a pullout from the book. That proved to be impossible and cost prohibitive. But we do have waterproof maps available separately through my website. Now, we also commissioned preparation of a website, which I think has some other very helpful information. Did that work? First of all, waterproof maps are available in 4 sets. The full set, Hancock to Trenton, then Lower, Middle, and Upper Delaware. I have a page about river conditions, right, which I think is something new. And there's something similar on the Greenway Partnership page. Well, what we have done, and I hired a programming expert to deal with this, we've selected 6 locations on the river, and then color-coded the current stage here on the right compared to the optimal stage. So this 3.61 feet at Callicoon is the actual stage right now. The data is fetched from the U.S. Geological Survey gauges at these stations. Right now, all of them are green. They're all optimal stage for Canoeing the Delaware, so get out there. Followed by the Park Service recommendations for boating stages on the Upper Delaware. I also have available signed copies of my book, if people are interested in that, available through the website, as well as another book I wrote last year about Hurricane Agnes called Bold Forecast. That's a narrative in the style of a novel account of the great flood of 1972. I'll go back to this home page, and I will, oops, I close that. And this concludes my presentation. I thank you so much for attending and for your participation. I'm told that we can open the floor to questions or comments or discussion. And if so, I'll let Mark handle that.
Actually, I'll do questions. We have one. Hold on, let me bring it up. I'm not sure which photo they're referring to. I did ask. So if this is your question, please put which photo you're asking about. But one of them was, the person thought there was an outhouse in the back of the raft.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take it.
There's an outhouse in the back of the raft.
That's convenient.
I suppose. I don't think that was a legitimate, it might have been a timber raft that they kind of outfitted for passengers.
Anybody else have, oh, here's a question. Can you explain the Tokes Island Dam original plan and subsequent result?
Oh my goodness. That's an entire presentation by somebody else. People know of the Tokes Island Dam. I will tell you a brief anecdote about my experience with the Tokes Island Dam. In the early 1970s, I worked in Stoke State Forest, New Jersey, with a program called the Youth Conservation Corps. In fact, on weekends, we would take those teenage kids working in the forest, and on weekends, we did outings. One of the outings we did was canoeing down the Delaware. There was no guidebook or any good maps or anything, and this really inspired me to write that first version of my book, Canoeing the Delaware River. The Tokes Island Dam controversy was fully aflame then, fully controversy. The squatters were being forced out. The Delaware River Basin Commission, the 4 states had to vote on whether or not to approve it. The governor of Pennsylvania was for it. The governor of New York was against it. The governor of Delaware said he would vote as the governor of New Jersey. That was Brendan Byrne. Brendan Byrne took a celebrated trip down the river himself in a canoe. He gave a speech on Tokes Island. But his commissioner of environmental protection was really charged with making a recommendation. His name was David Bardeen. So he did a hike from the Water Gap up to Rattlesnake Spring on the Appalachian Trail, if you know where that is. I was privileged to take along 2 of our teenage Corps members with him on this hike. He was quite the outdoorsman. He had a great big beard and khaki and regarded as something of a maverick. But he talked to people hiking on the trail, and we looked down and saw hundreds of canoes going down the river. It was a beautiful day. Everyone he talked to knew about the dam and was opposed to it. And we finished the hike at Rattlesnake Spring, and there's a trail register where you sign, log your trip on the trail. And he took a pen out of his pocket and he commented to me and the two teenage corpsmen with us that he would sign the trail register with the same pen that he would sign his recommendation to the governor to oppose the dam. And that is my story. I saw Fred Stein make a comment. Hi, Fred.
Yeah, he wrote, sure you've seen many changes paddling along the river over the years. What are some of the positive changes you've seen over the decades?
The wildlife has come back, especially in the upper river, especially the bears and the eagles. They're the most noticeable, but that's the one big positive change I've seen, the one that really stands out to me.
Things we always want to see. I don't know about the bear, but definitely the eagles. All right, another question. What do you know about the ferry that ran between Robsville, PA and Carpentersville, New Jersey?
Nothing.
Good answer.
There's a book about the ferries, all the ferries, written by Frank Dale, who wrote several books about the Delaware. He has an entire book devoted to the ferries of the Delaware. So I suggest whoever asked that, if they're interested, look it up. Frank Dale.
All right. And any more questions? Last chance. Oh, here's another one. Do you by chance know of a book about the industrial history along the river?
Not a single book, no, but I've looked at several different books, for example, about Easton, about Port Jervis, most of them around the turn of the 20th century. And of course, there's a lot about Philadelphia and Camden area.
Does the Delaware have a river keeper monitoring water quality?
I'll turn that over to Fred Stein.
Right? Let's see if I can get.
Yes, there's a Delaware River Keeper, DelawareRiverKeeper.org.
Yes, check them out. And then also DRBC does water quality monitoring as well. So, and Fred Stein just wrote a message to you. Can you see it?
I do, yes.
All right, cool. Great. Question was really for me, when will the recording be available? It might take a few weeks for our web developer to get it up, but it will be on our website under past events, and along with our other presentations, such as the one about bridges that you mentioned earlier. And
now I've got to go look up the Carpentersville Ferry.
You have homework.
That's right.
And any other questions? Well, thank you everyone for the questions and fantastic positive feedback. Thank you all for joining.
That took a little longer than we expected. I appreciate your attendance and your participation and attention.
So Gary, we just want to say thank you for giving the lecture. Greatly enjoyed the history and photos and pictures that went along with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.